If you walk through old farms that have been around for generations, you start noticing something strange. The fields don't look the way modern farms do. You don't just see straight rows of one crop stretching across the land. Instead, you see layers, fruit trees scattered through fields, patches of herbs along fences, perennial plants growing between crops that come and go every year. At first glance it looks messy, but it wasn't messy at all. It was intentional. Old farmers understood something that modern agriculture slowly forgot. A field that only grows one kind of plant every year becomes fragile. Soil gets tired. Pests find easy targets. Fertility has to be replaced again and again. So farmers built balance into the land. They mixed crops that grow for a single season with crops that stay in the ground for years. Annuals and perennials working together. That combination quietly solved several problems at once. Now, if you're new here on PermaYield, this channel is about rediscovering these kinds of long-term growing systems, gardens that become easier and more productive over time, instead of needing to be rebuilt every spring. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit the like button and subscribe right now. It really helps the channel and tells me you want more videos like this. Now, let's go back for a moment. Before modern tractors, before chemical fertilizers, before farming became industrial, land had to stay productive for generations. Farmers couldn't afford to exhaust the soil because their children would inherit that same ground. And soil takes time to rebuild. So instead of forcing the land to produce more every single year, they designed farms that supported themselves. Perennial plants played a huge role in that design. Take something as simple as perennial herbs growing along field edges. They attracted beneficial insects that helped control pests naturally. Instead of spraying chemicals, farmers allowed nature to handle the balance. Fruit trees scattered through fields did something else. Their roots reached deep underground, pulling nutrients upward that shallow annual crops couldn't reach. When leaves fell every autumn, they returned those nutrients back to the soil surface. It was like a slow, natural fertilizer cycle. Then there were perennial vegetables and forage plants growing between annual crop rows. These plants held soil together, prevented erosion, and kept living roots in the ground even when annual crops were harvested. That part is extremely important. Bare soil is vulnerable soil. Wind can carry it away. Sun can bake it hard. Rain can wash nutrients out of it. But when living roots stay in the ground year-round, soil life stays active. And soil life is what makes fertility possible. Modern farming gradually moved away from that idea. Fields became simpler, one crop at a time. Huge areas growing only corn, or only wheat, or only soybeans. It made machines easier to use, but the land lost its balance. Without perennial plants holding systems together, soil began needing outside inputs to stay productive. Fertilizer replaced natural nutrient cycles. Pesticides replaced insect balance. Farms became more efficient in the short term, but more fragile in the long term. Old farmers didn't necessarily explain it with modern science, but they saw the results. Land that kept perennial plants within the system stayed productive longer. Soil stayed softer. Water stayed in the ground instead of running off the surface. And crops often grew better because of it. You could walk through a farm and see annual vegetables growing right beside plants that had been rooted there for years. Those plants weren't competing. They were stabilizing the system. Once you understand that idea, it completely changes the way you look at a garden or farm. Instead of asking, what vegetable should I plant here this year? You start asking a different question. What permanent plants should exist here, so this space becomes stronger every year? That's exactly the kind of thinking we explore here on PermaYield. Because once perennial plants become part of the system, you're no longer rebuilding the garden every season. You're improving it. And the interesting part is that many of the crops old farmers used in these mixed systems are still available today. Some of them are surprisingly productive. Some protect soil in ways most gardeners never think about. And a few of them quietly make annual crops perform better. But over time, many of these practices slowly disappeared. Not because they stopped working, but because modern agriculture started optimizing for something different. Speed, uniformity, machines. And that's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because when those old systems disappeared, several hidden benefits disappeared with them. One of the biggest reasons old farmers mixed perennial plants with annual crops was something they understood very well, even if they didn't use scientific words for it. Soil exhaustion. When the same type of crop grows in the same place over and over again, year after year, the soil slowly loses balance. certain nutrients get pulled out faster than they can naturally return. Soil structure weakens. Microbial life decreases. The land becomes tired. Old farmers noticed this long before soil science existed as a field of study. They saw harvests shrinking when land was pushed too hard. They saw crops struggle where the soil had once been rich. So instead of depending on fertilizers that didn't exist yet, they worked with plants that naturally restored balance. Perennial plants were one of the most reliable tools for that. Because unlike annual crops, perennial plants stay rooted in the same place for years. Their roots grow deeper every season. They reach parts of the soil that annual vegetables never touch. Those deeper roots do something very important. They bring nutrients upward. Minerals that have slowly moved deeper into the soil get pulled back toward the surface through perennial plants. When leaves fall, when stems die back, or when plants are cut and dropped, those nutrients return to the topsoil where annual crops can use them again. It's like a slow recycling system built directly into the field. Another reason farmers kept perennials around was water. Perennial root systems create channels underground. These channels help rainwater soak into the soil instead of running across the surface. Over time, this improves how well soil holds moisture. In dry periods, fields with deep-rooted plants often stayed productive longer than fields made entirely of shallow-rooted annual crops. Even today, researchers studying regenerative agriculture are rediscovering this exact effect. Fields with mixed root depths hold water better, but old farmers didn't need research papers to tell them that. They simply saw which fields handled drought better. There was also another quiet benefit most people never think about: wind protection. Perennial plants, especially shrubs, hedges, and scattered trees, slowed wind across fields. When strong winds move across bare farmland, they dry soil quickly and can even carry topsoil away. But when fields contain layers of plants at different heights, wind slows down naturally. That protects both the soil and the crops. Then there were insects. Modern farming often treats insects as enemies that must be eliminated. But older farming systems treated insects as part of the balance. Perennial plants provided habitat for beneficial insects that controlled pests naturally. Ladybugs, predatory beetles, and parasitic wasps often live in perennial vegetation around fields. When pest populations rise in annual crops, these beneficial insects move in and reduce them. Without that habitat, those helpful predators disappear, and pest problems often grow worse. This is one of the hidden reasons pesticide use increased over time. When perennial habitat disappeared from farms, the natural insect balance disappeared too. So farmers replaced it with chemicals. Old farms didn't look simple. They looked alive. Trees, shrubs, herbs, vegetables, grains, many different plants working together in layers, each one contributing something different to the land. Some produced food directly. Others protected soil. Others supported insects. Others helped cycle nutrients underground. And when all those roles were combined, farms became far more stable. But stability isn't always what modern agriculture prioritizes. Over time, large-scale farming started focusing on efficiency for machines, straight rows, uniform crops, huge areas planted with the same species. It made planting and harvesting faster, but it also removed many of the plants that were quietly holding the system together. Perennials disappeared from many fields, and when they disappeared, the land slowly lost some of its natural support systems. That's when fertilizers increased. That's when pesticide use expanded. And that's when many farms began relying more heavily on outside inputs just to maintain productivity. The interesting part is that many gardeners today are rediscovering exactly what those older farmers already understood. Mixing perennial plants with annual crops doesn't reduce productivity. In many cases, it actually stabilizes it. But there's a very specific way those systems worked. Old farmers didn't just randomly scatter plants across fields. They placed perennials in very strategic locations where they strengthened the entire farm. And some of those placements were surprisingly clever. Old farmers didn't just mix plants randomly across the land. There was a pattern to it. If you look closely at traditional farms, you start noticing that perennial plants were often placed in very specific zones, not in the middle of every crop row, but in positions where they strengthened the entire field. One of the most common places was along the edges of fields. Field edges might contain fruit trees, berry bushes, herbs, or perennial vegetables. These edges acted like protective borders. Their roots held the soil in place, their branches slowed the wind. and their flowers attracted insects that pollinated crops or hunted pests. In other words, the edges of the field worked like a living support system, and those edges were incredibly important, because fields without edges are vulnerable. Wind moves faster, water runs off faster, insects have fewer places to live, the land becomes simpler, but also weaker. Old farmers knew that edges created life. Another place perennials often appeared was along paths and walkways. Instead of leaving paths completely bare, farmers sometimes planted hardy perennial plants beside them. These plants stabilized the soil that would otherwise get compacted by footsteps or carts. Some even produced herbs or edible greens that could be harvested quickly while walking through the farm. Nothing wasted space. Then there were scattered plants inside fields themselves. Sometimes fruit trees were spaced widely across crop areas. Annual crops grew between them, but the trees created shade patterns, dropped leaves, and sent deep roots into the soil. Over time, those trees improved soil fertility around them. Modern farming often removes trees from fields because machines need open space, but older farms frequently kept them, not in dense forests, but carefully spaced. These trees acted like nutrient pumps. Their roots pulled minerals upward from deeper soil layers. When leaves fell each year, those minerals returned to the topsoil where annual crops could use them again. It was a quiet but powerful cycle. Then there were perennial forage plants. Some farmers planted clovers, alfalfa, or other long-lived ground covers between crop cycles. These plants protected soil when annual crops weren't growing. They also added nutrients, especially nitrogen, which helped future crops grow better. Instead of leaving land empty after harvest, they kept plants growing. Living roots remained in the soil. That detail alone made a massive difference in soil health. Because soil life depends on living roots, microorganisms feed on root exudates, tiny compounds plants release underground. When roots disappear, soil microbes lose their food source. Old farmers didn't describe it that way, but they knew something important. Land with plants growing most of the year stayed more fertile. Another clever technique was planting perennial windbreaks. Rows of shrubs or trees were planted along the direction of prevailing winds. These windbreaks reduced how much wind hit the fields directly. Crops experienced less stress, soil lost less moisture, and erosion dropped dramatically. Even today, windbreaks are still one of the most effective tools for protecting farmland, but they used to be far more common. When you start looking at all these patterns together, something becomes very clear. Old farms were designed like ecosystems, not like factories. Different plants filled different roles. Some produced harvests every season. Others slowly improved the land year after year. Some supported insects and animals that helped control pests. Every piece contributed to stability. That's why many older farms stayed productive for generations without massive external inputs. The system supported itself. But then agriculture changed. As tractors became larger and farming became more industrialized, simplicity became the priority. Machines work best in wide open spaces with uniform crops. Trees were removed. Hedges disappeared. Perennial plants were cleared from fields. The land became easier for machines to manage, but it also became dependent on fertilizers, pesticides, and outside support. The natural systems that once protected the soil had been removed. Now the interesting part is this. Gardeners and small farmers today are slowly rediscovering the same patterns those older farmers used. Mixing perennials and annuals isn't outdated. In many cases, it's exactly what modern soil restoration efforts are trying to rebuild. But there's still one big question. If these systems worked so well, why did we stop using them? And the answer has less to do with plants, and more to do with how agriculture changed over the last century. So if these mixed systems worked so well, why did they disappear? The answer isn't that they stopped working. The answer is that agriculture changed its priorities. During the last century, farming moved toward speed, scale, and uniformity. Machines became larger, fields became bigger, and crops became simpler. A tractor moving through a field works best when everything is the same height, the same crop, and planted in straight rows. Trees in the middle of fields slow machines down. Shrubs and perennial patches make large equipment harder to use. So many farms removed them at first. This looked like progress. Fields became easier to plant and harvest quickly. A single crop could cover hundreds of acres. Production increased dramatically in the short term, but something else slowly disappeared at the same time. The natural support systems that perennial plants provided. When trees disappeared, deep nutrient cycling disappeared with them. When hedges were removed, beneficial insect habitats disappeared. When perennial ground covers were removed, soil spent long periods exposed to wind, sun, and rain. Without those stabilizing plants, farms needed something else to replace their roles. That's where fertilizers and pesticides entered the system. Instead of perennial plants bringing nutrients upward naturally, fertilizers were added from outside sources. Instead of beneficial insects controlling pests, chemicals were used to eliminate them. The land could still produce crops, but now it needed constant inputs to stay productive, and that dependency grew larger every decade. Now, here's the interesting part. Many farmers and gardeners today are realizing that the old systems weren't primitive at all. They were actually extremely intelligent. Those mixed systems reduced risk. If one crop struggled, others still produced. If weather changed suddenly, deeper-rooted plants stabilized the soil. If pests appeared, beneficial insects often kept populations under control. The farm functioned like an ecosystem instead of a single crop factory, and ecosystems are naturally resilient. That's why modern regenerative agriculture is bringing many of these ideas back. Farmers are reintroducing trees into fields, planting perennial hedgerows, growing nitrogen-fixing plants between crop rotations, not because the ideas are new, but because they worked before, and they still work now. The difference is that today we can understand the science behind what old farmers observed through experience. Living roots protect soil life. Mixed plant systems improve resilience. Perennials stabilize fertility and water movement. What those farmers practiced through observation, modern research is now confirming. And this is exactly the kind of thinking we explore here on PermaYield. A productive garden or farm doesn't have to restart from zero every year. When perennial plants become part of the system, the land slowly becomes stronger instead of weaker. Each season builds on the last one. The soil improves, the ecosystem becomes more balanced, and the garden begins to support itself. If this changed the way you think about planting annual crops, leave a comment and tell me one perennial plant you'd consider adding to your garden. I read those comments, and they often inspire future videos here on PermaYield. And if you know someone who believes modern agriculture invented everything we know about farming, share this video with them. Sometimes the most powerful ideas are the ones people quietly practiced for generations. Old farmers didn't mix perennials and annual crops by accident. They did it because the land worked better that way.